Thank you, Kathy, and thank you everyone from Keep Hyde Park Beautiful for asking us to do this. Like Kathy said, my name is Andres Ripley. I am the Greenway and Natural Resource Specialist for the Neponset River Watershed Association, and I'm excited to talk to you guys tonight. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about what our organization does, some of the projects that we do to combat some of the problems that we face, and then I'll tie in a little bit about some of the problems that we have on the Neponset River in Hyde Park, and some of the work that we're doing to try to face those problems. So just to give a quick overview of the Neponset watershed. So the Neponset River itself is roughly 29 miles long. It starts down here near Gillette Stadium in Foxborough, and then travels for 29 miles all the way into the Dorchester Bay. The watershed itself is roughly 120 square miles, and it encompasses 14 cities and towns. And for those of you who don't know what a watershed is, it's basically a geographic area of land that means no matter where it rains in that area, all of that water is going to drain to one central point. So whether it rains over here in Medfield, or it rains in Canton or Milton, all that water is going to come to the Neponset River and drain to this one central point, which is over here in the Dorchester Bay. And as an organization, we basically work to clean and protect the Neponset River, as well as the surrounding tributaries and lands that are in the watershed. And we do that through all kinds of different projects, and I'll talk about a couple of them briefly. We have river cleanups. As you guys know, we have ours coming up soon, and we'll talk more about that later on. We do water quality testing to see what the water is like within the watershed. We do education programs with schools. We do advocacy work. And all of these projects all focus around our mission of trying to clean and protect the Neponset River. I'm going to go into a couple of these projects in a little bit more detail for a little bit. So the first one that I think might be one of our most important projects is our Citizen Water Monitoring Network, which is basically a way for us to collect pretty concrete water quality data throughout the watershed at a given time. So we have over 50 volunteers who go out to designated sites throughout the year and collect water samples. Those samples are sent to the NepRWA lab at Deer Island, and they're tested for different parameters. And those parameters vary, but they're usually E. coli, which is bacteria, nutrient levels, and pH. And we rely very heavily on this data and on the volunteers because as a small nonprofit, it's very difficult for us to always be going out and collecting concrete water quality data at like one specific time when there's only about 10 of us on staff. So these volunteers make this possible. And with this data, it has a huge effect on the different projects that we're doing because let's say at Paul's Bridge in Milton, for example, there is a ton of E. coli one sampling day. We're going to go out there and we're going to try to figure out why the E. coli is so high, and that could lead us to finding a sewer leak or some other source of E. coli that's coming in and could lead to us trying to fix that problem. So the data from this project really has an effect on the other work that we're doing. One way that the water quality can be affected is through stormwater. And so for those of you who don't know what stormwater is, it's when you have precipitation coming down, so usually rain, and it's going to get onto the concrete on the streets, and it's going to mix with all the different kinds of pollution you can find on the roads. So things like car oil, gasoline, cigarettes, plastic, all of those things are going to mix in with the rain to create stormwater, and they're going to flow into the storm drains, which are the drains on the side of the roads, which is, this one's kind of covered, but that's what they look like. And the storm drains usually lead to the nearest body of water, which of course, in our case, is usually going to be the Neponset River or a small little brook that will drain to the Neponset River. So this is our biggest source of pollution because as you can imagine, there's all kinds of pollutants on the street, as many of you know, and all that stuff's going to be coming into the water every single time it rains. So one project that we have to try to combat this problem is by working with towns to help them meet their stormwater permitting requirements and to also build different ways to naturally filter the water. So this program is our Neponset Stormwater Partnership, where again, the towns are working with us to help meet their permitting requirements for stormwater, and we can work with them to build different best management practices to help filter the water, the stormwater, before it gets into the river. One example of this can be seen in this top photo here, which is a rain garden, which I think some of you are familiar with. But basically what happens is when the stormwater starts rushing towards the storm drain and it pools around the storm drain like it does in this case at Xaverian High School, this rain garden is going to kind of trap some of that storm water. The pollutants are going to get stuck in the dirt and in the plants, and the water is either going to slowly filter through the rain garden into the groundwater, or it's going to flow across and go into the storm drain as much cleaner water than it would have if the rain garden wasn't there. So that's one great way to filter the water naturally. Another example can be seen down on the bottom right, which is an example of tree box filters, where basically you have a tree that has been planted in the ground on a sidewalk, and you have this huge box underground that contains dirt in the roots and really like thick sediment that is great at filtering the water. And so when the stormwater rushes towards the storm drain, which is right here in the middle of the photo, it first has to kind of fall into the slits of the tree box filters. It will get filtered by that dirt and by the tree roots and then go into the storm drain as much cleaner water. So these are a couple examples of us working with towns to try to make stormwater less of an issue in our watershed. Another way that we try to improve the water quality is actually through education. So not just educating kids, but also educating adults too when we can through talks like this, for example. So when it comes to our normal education program, we go to all the 5th grade classes in all the towns in our watershed. We teach these kids about water conservation and stormwater pollution. It's an awesome way for the kids to get a hands-on experience and learn about what they can be doing to conserve more water at home or in their town, as well as making water pollution less of an issue. We do that a lot in the classes, and less often, but even more fun in my opinion, is actually meeting the students at the river, teaching them about water quality there out in the field, and even getting them in the river to look for these tiny little bugs called macroinvertebrates, which are great indicators for what the water quality is like. And as you can imagine, kids going on a field trip, they love doing this. They love getting out in the river. And for a lot of them, we're actually going in their backyard into the Neponset River where they don't get to do that all the time. So it's a great experience for them as well. Again, another way that we protect the watershed is through restoration efforts. I'm just going to highlight a couple of programs that we focused on over this past sampling year. One of those programs is our environmental DNA program, where volunteers are going out and collecting water samples. And then we're going to test those water samples. We're going to test those water samples for a specific trout DNA. And if we find that DNA in that sample, it means that there's a presence of trout in that area, which is awesome. We're going to be using that data to kind of compare to our pre-existing notions of where trout populations were. Are there still trout in that area that we thought they were in? Are there no longer trout there? Are there trout in a new area? And this data is going to help us figure out some of the restoration projects we want to do down the road. So we're really excited for this program and continuing it to evolve as we sample more next year as well. When we can, we also like to do small scale dam removal projects. We usually have to work with the property owner on this, obviously, and along the river, it tends to be the Department of Conservation and Recreation who own a lot of these dams. It's great to remove dams when you can, because a lot of the dams in the Neponset watershed no longer have a use. So they're kind of just acting like a barrier for animals and for humans as well. So by removing the dam, we're increasing the habitat for fish and other animals in the water. We're also improving the water quality because the water is not stagnant behind a dam, or it is stagnant behind a dam, but when you remove the dam, then the water can go back to its natural flowing state, which is good for the water quality. Another project that we do is invasive removal projects, where we go into a body of water or even on lands near the watershed or near the river and remove all kinds of plants. We did a project this past year removing water chestnut in Canton. We've removed Phragmites and Japanese knotweed and Mile-a-minute and purple loosestrife, all kinds of different plants in the past, and we'll continue to do that moving forward as well. So that's kind of highlighting, let's see if I can go on to the next slide. There we go. That's kind of highlighting some of the problems that we're facing all throughout the watershed, but I kind of want to zone in a little bit and talk more about the problems that the river is facing in Hyde Park, and kind of compare and contrast the similarities and differences in the problems that you guys face in Hyde Park. So one of the biggest problems in Hyde Park when it comes to the river is historic dumping. So people have, for many decades now, dumped all kinds of trash and debris into the river, either throwing it over their fence in their backyard, throwing it over the bridge, all kinds of household equipment, construction equipment, all of these things that have been dumped into the river. And that has all kinds of effects on the water quality and the passability of the river that we'll talk about more later. Another problem that you have in Hyde Park is the presence of legacy pollution. And if you don't know what legacy pollution is, it's basically when you have pollution that has been sitting in an ecosystem for a long period of time. So back in the day when we had many factories along the Neponset River and surrounding rivers, there were all kinds of chemicals and pollution that were dumped into the river. And a lot of them would flow downstream out into the ocean, but some of those pollutants and those chemicals would settle in the muck that we have in certain parts of the river or along the banks, and would stay there for a long period of time. And they're slowly leaking out of the banks and the muck back into the water column. So we have a couple examples of that happening in Hyde Park, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. As I said earlier, stormwater is not just a problem in Hyde Park, it's a problem everywhere, especially in Hyde Park where you have lots of paved surfaces and lots of litter and other kinds of things that are all over the road that can easily get into the storm drains when it rains. And then another problem you have when it comes to water quality in Hyde Park and passability in Hyde Park is the presence of the Tyleston and Hollingsworth Dam. It's a pretty big dam that has an effect on the water quality because, like I said earlier, the dam is going to slow the water down, so it's going to get a lot of sunlight on that water to heat it up. It's going to take out some of the oxygen out of it, so it's not as safe for the fish. And then also, of course, the fish aren't able to jump up over the dam, so it's decreasing the habitat for fish and many other animals. And then one more problem I want to talk about briefly that people don't think about so often is the accessibility to the river in Hyde Park and in many other neighborhoods. I put this little photo of a chain linked fence here in this bottom left corner because there are so many areas in Hyde Park that have fencing along the river and make it very hard to get up to its banks. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Now, as we talk about the river in Hyde Park, I also want to show a couple photos to try to help orient some of you guys who aren't as familiar as to where the river actually runs through your neighborhood. So let's just start down here at the bottom of the map where Paul's Bridge is. And actually right before the river gets to Paul's Bridge, it just traveled through an 8-mile long wetland called Fowl Meadow, which runs through Canton, Milton, and Westwood. And basically it's a humongous flat area in the center of the watershed, and it acts as a humongous filtration system where when the water comes into it, a lot of those pollutants kind of get stuck and get filtered out, but it's also a flood storage area. If we have a really big storm, let's say, a lot of that water rushing from the towns like Sharon and Foxborough and Canton, they're all going to hit Fowl Meadow, and they're going to slow down significantly before they enter into the Boston neighborhoods such as Hyde Park. So Fowl Meadow does you guys a great service in slowing down the water and eliminating flooding issues that could happen from upstream. So again, you can see there's a little photo I have here of people canoeing next to Paul's Bridge, where the river is starting to enter into Hyde Park. The river then kind of meanders its way through here and comes under Truman Parkway. And at this point, it basically follows Truman Parkway all the way through Hyde Park. It's going to kind of stay to the left of Truman Parkway here and past Martini Shell. And this is a little photo of the canoe access point at Martini Shell along Truman Parkway. It's going to continue going downstream past the Glenwood Ave Bridge, past the B Street Bridge. And right before it gets to the Dana Ave Bridge right here, this is right where Mother Brook comes in. So this is a little picture of Mother Brook. We'll talk more about Mother Brook and the history of Mother Brook and how it's affected the river in a little bit. Again, the river continues to head downstream. It goes under the Fairmount Ave Bridge. It passes by the West Street Urban Wild. It keeps going up this way. Up here is Doyle Park, which I think some of you are familiar with. I want to give a quick shout out actually to Southwest Boston CDC, people of Hyde Park wanting equal representation, many other groups who are working to improve the beauty of Doyle Park, and it's going to be a real awesome thing for the community to have when it's finished. Then as it passes Doyle Park, it goes over the Tyleston and Hollingsworth Dam, which is right about here, and continues its way down through Mattapan and Dorchester before it gets out into the bay. So those are just a couple photos to help orient you guys as to where the river is in your neighborhood. So let's talk a little bit about some of the history of the river in Hyde Park. Just like many other neighborhoods in this area, a long time ago, there was a huge industrial presence along the river. So there were a lot of factories being built, with a lot of dams being built on the river to help power those factories. So having the water rush over the dams was a way to actually make the factories operate on a daily basis. One problem though, that people were realizing when Europeans first came over here and first started to create all these factories and these dams, the Neponset was one of these first rivers that was actually starting to be used for industrial purposes. But they were realizing that the river is relatively flat. There's not a huge elevation change. And when you don't have a huge elevation change in the river, the water isn't flowing that quickly. So in order to make it flow at a faster rate than it was, they channelized and dredged the river. And by channelizing and dredging it, what you're basically doing is you're digging out the bottom a little bit to make the water levels a little bit lower than they naturally would be. And you're putting in these concrete stones along the sides to create this trapezoid-like shape, right? So you have a more narrow bottom than you do up top. So it's really pushing the water forward and making it move at a much faster rate, which of course is great for the dams and for the factories, but has all kinds of ecological impacts that were bad for the river. Also, not just did it impact the water quality, but it also impacted the accessibility to the river as well. if you wanted to get down into a canoe down here, it's very hard to navigate down these steep banks that can often be slippery. And also by implementing these stones here, they're kind of removing the natural muddy bank systems that you can find along the edges of rivers. And by doing that, you can easily build up to the sides of the rivers so that you can see all kinds of developments near the rivers. There was fencing near the rivers. So this obviously had a huge impact on how the public could access the river. And we still have impacts of that today as well. The main dam in Hyde Park that I talked about earlier that really was a huge industry was the Towson and Hollingsworth Dam in Hyde Park. You have a dam that really powered the Towson and Hollingsworth paper mill that was on the Milton side, but it hasn't been used for its original purpose in many years at this point. It's kind of just sitting there, and it's not good for the environment. Like I said earlier, it's slowing the water down, fish can't get up it, and of course, if as humans who are trying to access the river, you can't get up and over that in a canoe as well. This photo on the left, I believe, was taken in the 90s, where you can see the water is flowing directly over the top of the dam, and that's probably about a 10-foot drop that water is taking right there. But on the right here on this photo, this is a photo of what the dam currently looks like. I was out in, I think, end of July and took this photo. And as you can see, there's many holes that are in the dam now, and water is just slowly breaching through the dams, which is obviously a huge problem. Because if there's a big enough storm, it could wipe out that dam. It could have all kinds of ecological impacts and impacts on human life as well if that dam is wiped out. So hopefully at some point soon we can get that dam removed. The Department of Conservation and Recreation, DCR, own this dam, and of course they are very underfunded and understaffed, so it's hard for them to come up with the money to actually remove this dam. But we've been working with them for many decades now and trying to find a way to get it out so the river can kind of be in a more safe and natural state. One reason why it's so expensive to actually remove dams is because you're not just removing the physical structure of the dam, you also have to dredge and remove all the contaminants that are behind the dam. Because when you slow the water down, if there's any chemicals that were flowing in that water, as it's slowing down, those chemicals are kind of settling in the muck on the bottom, and they're going to be staying there for a long period of time. One chemical that we have a lot of, unfortunately, in the Neponset River are called polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. PCBs were used a lot, basically all through the early and mid 1900s, and they were banned in the late 1960s. But they were used a lot in factories to create electrical equipment. They were used in transformers for telephone poles. And there was such an abundance of them that it was very easy for a lot of them to leak out of the factories, either intentionally or unintentionally, and get into nearby bodies of water. The two photos I have here are on Mother Brook. So Mother Brook, like I said earlier, is a body of water that comes into the Neponset. It was man-made, and it was actually the first canal created in the United States, and it currently connects the Charles River and the Neponset River. And for many years, there were hundreds of factories and hundreds of dams along Mother Brook. And all those factories, or many of them rather, were polluting the river. And of course, since Mother Brook is flowing into the Neponset, that pollution was also flowing into the Neponset as well. So a study was done a few decades ago looking at the PCB levels in Mother Brook. It was done by the Department of Environmental Protection and the EPA, and they found extremely high levels of PCBs in Mother Brook. They made the companies that dumped all of those PCBs many years ago pay for the majority of the cleanup, but they didn't consider testing the Neponset at that time to figure out how many PCBs were in the Neponset. After that project was completely wrapped up and they had dredged most of Mother Brook and they had cleaned almost 100% of the PCBs out of Mother Brook, they eventually did a study on the Neponset and found that there's also high levels of PCBs in the Neponset between Mother Brook and the Baker Chocolate Dam in Dorchester. Unfortunately, we wish, of course, that they had made those companies pay for that removal process then, but it didn't come to that at that time. So currently, the EPA is doing a study and is trying to see if the Neponset River can be designated as a Superfund site, which basically means it would be considered an area for a large-scale cleanup to take place, where the EPA would come in, they'd try to figure out who put the PCBs there, which of course is probably people who were on Mother Brook back in the day. And then those companies would have to pay for a little bit of it. There would also be governmental funding thrown in for the cleanup process. But hopefully, if we do get designated for a Superfund site, There will be a many-year process of removing the PCBs and other bad chemicals that we have in the Neponset in that area. And the areas that have very high levels of these chemicals, such as behind the Baker Dam and the T&H Dam, by dredging those areas, the dam removal process for those would become much cheaper and much easier for DCR to do. So we're looking forward to seeing where this project could go, and we'll definitely keep everyone updated with any big updates that come for that project. Now, another thing that you have in Hyde Park, like I said earlier, is the presence of dumping. People have always dumped yard waste and construction equipment and all kinds of trash over the river, over their fences into the river and along the banks, and that has a huge effect on the water quality. We have been doing river cleanups now along the Neponset for many, many decades at this point. For at least 3 or 4 decades, there have been on and off cleanups happening at different scales. But it wasn't really until the early 2010s that some real environmental activists from Hyde Park played a huge role in changing how we did cleanups along the Neponset. And I want to give them a quick shout out. Barbara Baxter, Rita Walsh, and Martha McDonough played a huge role in changing how we did cleanups along the Neponset River. They actually were the ones who really started doing them on their own, and we helped them out where we could. And then it's kind of evolved more into us doing the work and them advising us. Again, without them, I don't think the Neponset would be anywhere as clean as it would be today, and they've played a huge role in making it much cleaner in Hyde Park. So when they came to us and we started doing this, there was all kinds of debris along the river in the Hyde Park section. We would go in and take out small things like plastic cups and plastic bottles and all of that smaller plastic-like things. But you could also find car parts and even full cars, as you can see in the bottom left, that we took out a couple of years back. There's shopping carts, other metal debris that have just kind of been thrown into the Neponset to be forgotten about, but they've had terrible impacts on the water quality. So now, after almost 10 years of doing cleanups in Hyde Park, at least once a year, sometimes even 2 or 3 times a year, Hyde Park is getting a good problem in that there's less trash to be removed every year out of the river. So we've been able to start expanding our cleanups more than just to Hyde Park, but also into Mattapan and Dorchester and Quincy, Milton, many other towns as well that also have dumping issues. So these cleanups are going to continue to evolve. We might even down the road do more invasive species removal at cleanups. Who knows? But as of right now, we're very thankful for everyone who's volunteered in the past and in the present to help these cleanups actually happen. And we're looking forward to our fall cleanup taking place in a couple of days now on Saturday, September 26th. I think many of you guys are going to be there at sites in Hyde Park and maybe other places. But we're really looking forward to that cleanup taking place. So a couple of things I want to hit on right now for what you guys can all be doing to make the river a safer and more accessible area. Of course, volunteering, like I said, many of you guys volunteer at our cleanups, and you can also get involved with our invasive species removal projects or our water quality sampling, all kinds of volunteer opportunities that you can do with NepRWA. Please go to our website at neponset.org to learn more about the different opportunities that we offer. Some more basic things that I'm sure many of you guys already know, but something to consider as well. Please do not litter, and please make sure that family and friends are not littering. People tend to drop something on the road and kind of forget about it and not really think about the journey it's going to take to its final destination, which tends to be body of water. So when we litter on the sidewalks, it's going to go into the storm drains and into the Neponset. We don't want that happening. So please do not litter and continue to advocate for people not littering. Also educating folks on storm drains now. If you didn't know what a storm drain was before tonight, now you know what it is. Now you know where it leads to. So please make sure that you're not putting any trash near storm drains. Make sure your friends and your family are not putting any trash near storm drains. We want storm drains to stay nice and clean. We don't even really want sticks or leaves on them, honestly, like I have in this photo here. It's great just to have them nice and open so that the rainwater can rush right into them and right into the rivers as very clean water. Picking up after our dogs is going to really help reduce the amount of E. coli and bacteria we have coming into the river. There are very high levels of E. coli when it rains, and a lot of that has to do with dog waste and other bacteria washing off the sidewalks. So picking up after our dogs when we can and throwing that out at home is always going to help improve the E. coli levels. And then most importantly, I think, is using this beautiful area to our advantage. We have really nice trails and accesses to the river in Hyde Park. As many of you know, you have the Neponset River Greenway Trail that runs from Hyde Park to Dorchester, mainly along the river. So please continue to use that trail when you can. Please, if you have the ability to, get out on the river in a canoe or kayak. You can go to our website to learn about the different access points and canoe launches there are in the river in Hyde Park and in the other areas around you. But the more people that we have out using these beautiful spaces that we have, it's going to help advocate for more work to be done along the river. It's going to bring more attention to it. And eventually it's going to improve the ecosystems, the water quality, and the habitat for humans and animals alike. So thank you very much. And now we have time for some questions.
So you can either type your questions in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask. Pat, do you have a question?
I do. I have a couple of questions. One was, I was interested when you said you were doing stormwater partnerships with the cities and towns to make sure they're stormwater permitting something. Are you actually working with the city of Boston? Let me just give you the questions and then you can take them whenever you want. So that was one question. Are you working with the actual city of Boston? Number two, when you said you're working with fifth graders in the towns, are you working with any fifth grade classes in Hyde Park, any of the schools in Hyde Park? And then someone just sent me the emergency plan for the Tyleston Hollingsworth Dam for if there's, I don't know if it was, I haven't read it yet. I just got it from Barbara Hamilton. I wondered if you could say anything about that. It has to do with, I guess, I don't know if it's for flooding or storms or what. And then my last question is, any more news on the time frame for Superfund designation?
I'll answer the last one first because it's the quickest answer. It's basically the process got pushed back roughly 9 months to a year because of the pandemic. They just weren't able to do as much work. So the goal is to have it designated, is to have the Neponset designated for a Superfund site by winter 2021. It was supposed to be winter 2020, now it's going to be winter 2021. To answer your other questions, yes, we do work with Boston Water and Sewer on stormwater permitting stuff. They more or less have their own process that they do when it comes to meeting their permitting requirements, but we do collaborate and bounce ideas off one another with them, and we are always meeting with them to talk about different permitting requirements. When it comes to our education programs, we have mainly only worked in the towns, so not the city of Boston. We've mainly only worked in the towns in the watershed because the way that we receive funding through that is through the stormwater partnership that I referenced there. So although we're working with the towns and we're working a little bit with Boston, we're not working with Hyde Park specifically on stormwater work. We have started to try to integrate into the Boston Public Schools. We've had a couple of meetings with them before the pandemic started about how we could work together for the 2020-2021 season. And we're still trying to figure out if there's a way we can do that remotely. But yes, we have started to work with schools in Hyde Park and in Mattapan. I worked with the Young Achievers School in Mattapan on a fifth grade education program, as well as another school, another private school that I can't think of in Hyde Park as well.
Not Boston Prep?
Wasn't Boston Prep. I can't remember off the top of my head or not, to be honest. Okay. And there was, what was your third question? I missed one.
The other question was, someone sent me, which I haven't looked at yet, and it's an emergency plan for the Tyleston Hollingsworth Dam. Yeah. I guess if something happens during flooding or storming or something, have you ever heard of that?
I've heard of the plan. I haven't read it myself or know what's on it. I have a feeling it might have to do with flooding. But one good thing that came from people dredging the river is when they made basically the bottom of the river lower in the ground, it made it harder for big floods to happen. So as many of you guys know, the banks of the river are much higher than where the water level tends to be. So it would take a really, really big storm for any flooding to really occur. Even if the T&H dam was to flood or was to break, I just don't even think there'd be enough water to really flood into the majority of neighborhoods along the river. So I'd be interested in reading the emergency plan, but I'm not too familiar with what's actually on it, to answer your question.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat. Briefly, it says, there was a beep on the line when you explained the significance of trout presence. Can you touch on that?
Yeah. So trout are a very sensitive species, depending on what trout you're talking about, but brook trout are very sensitive because they need very cold water. And as we have, hotter days in the summer with climate change happening, and we have less rain events happening and they're more sporadic, the habitat of trout is getting worse for them to survive in. So we do a lot of projects, trying to figure out what we can do to save the trout, because they are actually an endangered species in a lot of different areas. We have a few trout streams in the watershed where we're doing testing, like I said earlier, where we're basically we collect a water sample and we test it for trout DNA. And we're not doing it, we're sending it off to a lab to test it. But this technique they use is so precise and specific that they can find one little strand of DNA from a trout that can be up to 1 kilometer away from where that sample was taken. It's a very unique and special protocol that they're using. And again, we're just using it to try to update our knowledge on where the trout are, because if we find an area where there are trout now that we didn't know they were before, or if there's an area that there used to be a ton of trout in, but they're no longer there, it's going to lead to more restoration projects happening down the road to try to restore the habitat and make it safer for those trout to live in. Great question.
Another question in the chat is, did things improve here locally in Hyde Park with the renovation of the Dana Avenue Bridge?
That's an awesome question. I can't give specific examples of things getting better with the renovations of it. I think that they improved the stormwater infrastructure on the bridge. I'm not positive about that. But the company who did it, which is Giosio and Sons, we are familiar with them. We've worked with them in the past. And I know that they were very careful with, making sure they weren't harming the water in any way when they were doing that project.
Okay, another question. Has NepRWA ever worked with DCR to improve signage along the river, like with no dumping signs or no fishing?
Awesome question. Yeah, there's a long history of not just NepRWA, but other organizations like Southwest Boston CDC, for example, trying to work with DCR and with the Department of Public Health to figure out, are there ways we can get signage along the river? To answer your question, yes, we have worked with DCR. We're going to continue to work with DCR. We're trying to find ways to get signage put along the trail. And hopefully there'll be signs coming in the near future, not just along the Greenway trail saying, no dumping or don't eat the fish, but more interpretive signage as well to make it more accessible and friendly and inviting to everyone.
I have a question that's a little off topic, but not so far. I live near a bridge that crosses Mother Brook near the Mill Pond area. And people fish from that bridge and they eat the fish or some of the fish that they catch from there.
Yeah.
Is that a safe practice or not?
I don't know for sure, because I know they cleaned up a lot of, when they did this big cleanup on Mother Brook, they cleaned out a lot of the chemicals that were in there. Because again, the problem with PCBs when it comes to an environmental standpoint is that when you have all these chemicals kind of in the mud, the PCBs work their way through the food chain. You have small animals who are kind of eating things in the mud that are ingesting some of the PCBs, and the bigger animals eat those smaller animals, and it kind of just works its way up through the food chain because the PCBs are kind of sitting in the fatty tissue in all of these animals. So if there are chemicals like PCBs present and you're eating the fish, you are also ingesting those PCBs into your body. I wouldn't recommend eating fish from Mother Brook, and definitely not from the Neponset, obviously, because we have high levels of PCBs. Fishing just like by itself and then releasing it is fine, but eating it is probably not the best thing to do.
Yeah. You never know when to interfere with someone's lunch.
It's difficult. It's very difficult. A lot of people rely on the food they catch sometimes as their meal. So it's a balance of making sure people can eat, but also letting them know about the health impacts that could come with what they're eating.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
A question asking you, Andres, if you're an environmental engineer or what your background is.
Great question. I graduated a few years ago from Wheaton College in Norton with my undergraduate degree in biology. I really focused a lot on animal behavior during my time in college, not so much water resources and environmental science like I'm doing now. But it's been a pretty great transition for me. I started working with NepRWA maybe a month and a half after I graduated from college, and I've learned so much about the importance of keeping our waterways clean and how that's going to have an impact on all ecosystems around it. So thank you for asking that.
And someone made the point that the Dana Avenue Bridge is now named the Grimke Sisters Bridge.
Yes. Yes. Which I haven't heard, I forget stories I've heard of the Grimke sisters, but I know that they've played a large role in Hyde Park's history, which is awesome.
Thank you very much, Andres. This is an excellent presentation. Very good.
Thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
Any other questions? I have a question about the stencils. You had a photo of a stencil by the drain. Is that something that you're trying to do in different communities, or trying to get volunteers to help stencil? And if so, would they go on every storm drain or just certain ones?
Great question. The answer is yes, we are trying to start a new volunteer project where basically we can give volunteers the supplies that are pretty simple supplies. It's a little plaque that says like, don't dump drains to the Neponset River. We give them like the glue that they can use to put it down, and they can just put them around in their neighborhoods. We started working on that project this summer. It was like a project that our interns were doing over the summer, and I'm not sure of the current state, but I'm not sure of the current state of the project, but I believe by next year, we're going to try to start having volunteers going out to different areas and putting them out. So I'll be sure to be in contact with you, Kathy, and you can spread the word in Hyde Park. I don't think as of right now, we're like, oh, this storm drain in this town specifically needs one. But I'm sure there are a few in mind, especially in Hyde Park, where it'd be great to have some of those markers put down. So I'll keep you in the loop for sure on that, because the more people we have on that, the better, and the more education we can do to just people every day walking by a storm drain, learning about where it's going.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
And there's something else I noticed. There's like a big, I don't know, like storm drain by the new urban garden called We Grow Microgreens. And there's a big net on it that catches all the trash.
Mm-hmm.
So
you're seeing it's like the net's over the top of the storm drain? Is that how it works? Or is it like just under the top of the storm drain cover?
No, it's not a drain. It's like a big pipe that kind of filters all of the drains into the river or something.
Oh, I see. So it's more on like the outfall pipe is the opening that brings the water into the river. That's where you saw it?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I don't know who's responsible for putting that there. I don't know if it was a City of Boston initiative or someone else, but basically that's just there to help trap some of the plastics and stuff that could be flowing from the storm drain in. And maybe every once in a while someone will come and clean that out and dump it out somewhere else instead of letting it just flow into the river.
Yeah, it was packed full of trash when I saw it.
Sure. I'm sure. I hope that whoever put that there was going to go clean it out in the near future, because if you have too much backup of stuff, you could have flooding onto the street, which could definitely not be a good thing.
Right.
Yeah, I thought it was you, Andres, who told me that once, that all the storm drains somewhere between the storm drain and the outfall, that somewhere in between there's a grate that stops all the trash. Is that not true?
Oh, there's not. In some cases, there's like, I can think of one example that I've seen recently along Edgewater Drive in Mattapan, where there's a metal grate that I think really is to make sure people aren't climbing up it, or big animals aren't climbing up the storm drain from the outfall side. But there really isn't a filter inside the storm drain. It's really just a big pipe that's just bringing water and trash to the nearest bodies of water. So a lot of towns and a lot of organizations like NepRWA are trying to figure out ways that we can work to filter the water before it even gets into the storm drain, like creating rain gardens and other things like that.
Or is there a way to put a filter inside the storm drain if you have to?
There is, yeah. There are definitely ways to put filters inside. They're a little bit more expensive, and the problems with that are that there are so many storm drains and not enough people who actually get paid to clean them out. I think in the watershed, we have something like maybe 50,000 storm drains, some really high number of storm drains. And the people who are paid by the towns to go do that can maybe clean a storm drain out anywhere from like once every few months to maybe once a year, or maybe even more than that if it's not a very highly impacted storm drain. So if you put a net in there, it's going to catch a lot of those pollutants, but those pollutants can build up very easily, like Kathy said, and that can lead to flooding issues and things like that. So it's a balance that you have to try to figure out to make sure that the pollution isn't getting into the water, but we're also finding a way to not create flooding issues by having a lot of pollution piling up.
Another question, I had heard that there were sections of the river that were safe to canoe and sections that you should avoid because of the PCBs. So
That's a good question. So I think you may have heard that. I don't know if it was for PCBs or if it was for E. coli. If you're canoeing in the river and there's PCBs present, like I said, the PCBs are only present in the really mucky areas, literally within the muck. So if you're on top of the water canoeing, you're not going to really have an impact with that muck. You're going to be safe there. In terms of like wading around in the river with high PCB levels, it's not as advised as much, but you need to have very repeated exposure to see any effects from PCBs. There are lots of studies that show you need to like have multiple days in a row for X amount of time to have an impact. If you're just going canoeing once a month, let's say on the Neponset River over some PCBs, again, you won't have any impacts from them. But if you're, stomping around in the mud as a kid in the PCBs once a month for like a couple months, it's not going to have a large impact on you.
Okay, and another question in the chat. Who would we contact about the drain clutter that Kathy recently saw? So the one that I was just talking about.
That's a good question. I would probably contact Boston Water and Sewer, who play a role in all things that are happening in that stormwater infrastructure. You could also send us a photo, us as in people at Neponset River Watershed Association. We could try to figure out who put it there, maybe talk to some people that we know in Boston Water and Sewer and other organizations, and then we can get back to you with more information if you didn't hear from someone else.
Kathy, that drain that you talked about drains into Mother Brook, just south of the waterfall.
Okay.
And there is some sort of grate there, and it too is loaded with trash.
Interesting. And to answer your other question, Kathy, I think you're the only time, not the only time, but one time that it's like you can find out if it's safe to boat or swim along the river is from our water quality data. For the most part, almost all of the watershed meets boatable standards for bacteria during the majority of the year. Swimmable standards, not as much, because the E. coli levels have to be very, very low for it to be considered safe for humans to swim in. But boating, it's almost always safe to swim to boat throughout the entire watershed.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, great. And do we want to touch on the cleanup this weekend before we sign off?
Yeah, I can just talk about it a little bit more too. I think is almost everyone in here probably going to be coming to the cleanup. But we have a couple sites in Hyde Park. I know we have Doyle Park as one of the sites. We have the Glenwood Ave Bridge. We have the Blake Estates site, which is by the Blake Estates Urban Wild, right where Mother Brook and the Neponset River are connecting. And we could have one more that I'm missing that I can't think of. But it's going to be from 9 to 11 on Saturday. If you haven't registered, please go to our website and register right now. We are almost completely full of volunteers because we are taking social distancing protocols very seriously for this cleanup. Most sites are only going to have somewhere around 12 volunteers at them, with everyone needing masks and having the proper equipment. I think someone just joined back in.
Yeah.
But yeah, please make sure that you register if you haven't yet, and make sure that you bring your mask with you. We'll give you all the equipment that you need. And it's going to be a great time. It's a great way to improve the river, get all the pollution that we have in the river out of it, and also get pollution off the banks and the surrounding parks as well.
And I think when I signed up, I saw that the Doyle playground group is going to be on dry land.
Yes.
And the other two sites will be in the river or on the banks of the river.
Yeah, that's correct. Of course, if you sign up for a site that has like water-based cleanup, no one's going to force you to go in the river. There's plenty of things to do along the banks. As you said, Doyle is going to be completely in the park and in the woods between the river and the park. You won't have to get wet there at all. The Glenwood Ave Bridge, there's going to be people both in the water and people up on the bridge doing some cleanup work. So there's always a chance to stay dry no matter where you go.
Andres, I didn't know if you heard this about what was, and I know that I talked to Joe and Janet about this the other day. There was a thing happening at Doyle where people were using gas grills and gas tanks in the park, and then leaving the gas tank in there. And then somebody drove an abandoned huge van and left it into the park. And so we contacted DCR, and they put the big boulders back on River Street. And I also found the name of the people who own the apartment building across River Terrace. DCR contacted them. They said they'd notify tenants. So I don't know where that all is heading, but in terms of the signage that you were talking about, you know, we've asked DCR a million times for signs, but the
Yes, you
problem
have.
is they have to get them in Spanish and Haitian Creole too. So do you have any movement on that at all, or?
I haven't heard any movement in the past couple, well, honestly, since the pandemic started from DCR's end about what they want to do with signage or what they can do. I feel like the update I heard right when the pandemic was starting is that they are now shifting all of their signage efforts to COVID-related signs. So making sure people, you know, are wearing masks and all of that important signage that everyone can understand. I haven't heard any other updates as of right now, but we're trying to work with Jenny Norwood, who I know you're familiar with, Pat, at DCR, and other staffers at DCR to try to figure out where we can get signs put along the river and along the Neponset River Greenway Trail.
All right, any final questions?
Yeah, just one question. Has the drought had any impact on the Neponset River?
It definitely has. When you have drought at this scale that we're having and that we expect to see more of in the future, it has a lot of environmental impacts. First of all, we've had a couple streams that we normally take samples from that have actually completely dried up this summer, where you have not even like a little trickle of water. There's just zero water in some of these smaller streams, which, as you can imagine, is going to affect some of the small fish that are in those streams and the insects and other animals. But when you have, you know, water levels this low, or when the water levels are this low and the rain is coming this infrequently, it tends to, you know, impact the water quality in a negative way because you're having less water coming in and less water flowing out. So the water's a little bit more stagnant than it normally would be. There's a lot more sunlight that's hitting it, which is letting it warm up a lot more. There's a lot less oxygen coming into the water, which of course the fish and the animals need to breathe underwater. So there's all kinds of environmental impacts that come from the drought. And we're worried about what the future holds when it comes to more drought scenarios like this happening, but we're going to continue to try to find ways to protect the watershed and protect all the animals and the water quality moving forward, just like we've been doing.
Good, thanks.
Yeah, good question.
All right, well, thank you, Andres. This was a really interesting presentation, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great,
Hey,
Andres.
you're welcome. Thank you guys for being here, and I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you guys soon in a couple days.
Okay.
Yes, we'll see you on Saturday.
See you.
See you on Saturday. Have a good one.